Alessandro Rossi had the kind of reputation that opened doors across Europe. For 30 years, he'd been perfecting his craft, playing in some of the most prestigious concert halls in the world: La Scala in Milan, Carnegie Hall in New York, the Royal Albert Hall in London. His violin had sung in places where only the best were invited to perform. At 52 years old, Alessandro carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he'd achieved. His salt and pepper hair was always perfectly combed back. His suits were tailored in Florence. Even the way he held his violin case suggested a man who understood his own worth. When the invitation arrived from Mexico City, Alessandro almost didn't accept it. An international music competition needed judges, and someone had recommended him. The organizers were offering a generous fee, first-class accommodations, and the kind of respect he'd grown accustomed to receiving. But Mexico? He'd never performed there. Never even visited. In his mind, it wasn't exactly the cultural center of the classical music world. Still, the money was good, and his agent convinced him it would be good for his image. "Expanding your global presence," his agent had said over the phone. Alessandro agreed, though he privately thought of it as more of a charitable gesture on his part. He'd go, judge some hopeful musicians, collect his fee, and return home to Milan. The flight was long. Alessandro spent most of it reviewing scores and making notes about technique. He had high standards, and he wasn't about to lower them just because he was in a different country. Excellence was excellence regardless of location. That's what he told himself as the plane descended into Mexico City's airport. The competition organizers had arranged a welcome reception at a beautiful colonial building in the historic center. The architecture was stunning, Alessandro had to admit. High ceilings, ornate details, warm lighting that made everything glow. Tables were spread with local food, and there was a bar in the corner where people gathered with drinks. Alessandro arrived fashionably late, as was his habit. He liked making an entrance. Several people approached him immediately, introducing themselves, thanking him for coming, telling him how honored they were to have a violinist of his caliber judging their competition. He accepted their praise with practiced humility, nodding and smiling in all the right places. About an hour into the reception, Alessandro found himself in a conversation with a group of local musicians. They were friendly, enthusiastic, asking him about his career, his experiences performing around the world. He answered their questions, enjoying the attention, sipping his wine. Then one of them, a guitar player probably in his 40s, mentioned mariachi music. His eyes lit up as he spoke about it. "It's the soul of our country," the man said with genuine passion. "The violin in mariachi, it's something special. The way it weaves through the other instruments, the emotion it carries." Another musician jumped in, a woman who played trumpet. "There's so much technique involved," she explained. "People don't realize how demanding it is. The speed, the precision, the stamina required to play for hours." Alessandro listened politely, but inside, he felt a familiar superiority rising. These people were talking about street music as if it were serious art. He'd heard mariachi before in movies and restaurants. Men in decorated suits playing for tourists and parties. It was festive, sure, but it wasn't serious music, not like what he did. "It's interesting," Alessandro said, his tone carrying just enough condescension to make his real opinion clear. "But it's rather common music, isn't it? Entertainment for parties and celebrations." The group fell quiet. A few exchanged glances. "What I mean," Alessandro continued, not noticing or perhaps not caring about the shift in atmosphere, "is that it's folk music, street entertainment. There's a certain charm to it, I suppose. But it doesn't require the same level of mastery as classical violin. Anyone can play a few simple tunes with enough practice." The guitar player's expression hardened. "Have you ever actually studied mariachi music?" he asked. Alessandro gave a dismissive wave. "I don't need to study it to recognize its limitations. I've dedicated my entire life to understanding what real violin mastery requires. The composers I interpret, Bach, Paganini, Tchaikovsky, they demand years of rigorous training, understanding of theory, technical perfection." "And you think mariachi doesn't?" the trumpet player asked quietly. "I think there's a reason why mariachi is played in restaurants while classical violin is performed in concert halls," Alessandro replied. He took another sip of his wine, satisfied with his answer. The conversation died after that. The group dispersed, people finding excuses to move to other parts of the room. Alessandro didn't think much of it. He'd stated the truth as he saw it. If they were offended, that was their problem. He wasn't going to pretend that all music was equal just to spare someone's feelings. What Alessandro didn't know was that his words were already traveling through the room. In a community as tight-knit as Mexico City's musical world, news spread fast. By the time he left the reception an hour later, dozens of people had heard what the Italian judge had said about their beloved mariachi tradition. Alessandro returned to his hotel satisfied. It was a nice place, 5 stars with a view of the city. He unpacked his things carefully, hung up his suits, and placed his violin case on the desk. Tomorrow the competition would begin, and he'd do what he came here to do. Judge these musicians by the same exacting standards he applied everywhere. He had no idea that his casual dismissal of mariachi had landed, like an insult in a room full of people who dedicated their lives to that very tradition. He didn't know that some of those street musicians he'd dismissed had trained for decades, mastering techniques and repertoire that stretched back generations. He had no clue that his words had reached the ears of one particular young woman who took them as a personal challenge. Alessandro slept well that night, confident in his opinions, secure in his expertise. He'd judged music and musicians for 3 decades. He knew what he was talking about. Tomorrow would be another day of listening to hopeful performers, most of whom would fall short of true excellence. It was what he expected, what he'd always experienced, but tomorrow would also bring something Alessandro Rossi wasn't expecting. Someone who would challenge everything he thought he knew, someone who would make him question assumptions he'd held for his entire career. Tomorrow he would meet a young violinist who would teach him that sometimes the most accomplished expert can be the most ignorant. As Alessandro drifted off to sleep in his comfortable hotel bed, that violinist was across the city preparing. She'd heard what he said. She knew exactly what he thought of her music, her tradition, her life's work. And she was ready to show him just how wrong he was. The stage was set. The challenge had been issued, even if Alessandro didn't know it yet. And by this time tomorrow, his comfortable certainty about music, about mastery, about what deserved respect and what didn't, would begin to crumble. The competition venue was impressive. Alessandro had to give them that much. The concert hall was modern, with excellent acoustics and comfortable seating. He arrived early, as he always did before judging, to familiarize himself with the space and review his notes. The morning sun streamed through tall windows as he settled into his seat in the judging area. A folder with the day's schedule sat on the table in front of him, along with scoring sheets and a bottle of water. He opened the folder and scanned through the list of performers. Classical piano, classical violin, chamber music ensembles. This was more like it. Real music performed by serious musicians. Alessandro was reviewing his criteria for judging when he sensed someone approaching. He looked up to see a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, walking toward him with purpose. She wore jeans and a simple white blouse, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. There was something in her stride that caught his attention. Confidence without arrogance. Determination without aggression. "Mr. Rossi?" she said, stopping a respectful distance away. "Yes?" Alessandro set down his papers and looked at her properly. She had the kind of direct gaze that suggested she wasn't easily intimidated. "My name is Sofia Mendez. I'm a violinist. I'll be performing here later today." She spoke clearly, her English accented but fluent. Alessandro nodded politely, assuming she was another nervous competitor looking for advice or trying to make an impression on one of the judges. It happened all the time. "Well, I wish you the best of luck, though I should mention that it wouldn't be appropriate for me to discuss your performance before I hear it." "I'm not performing in the category you're judging," Sofia said. "I'll be playing in the Mariachi showcase this afternoon." Alessandro's expression shifted slightly. Ah, so word had gotten around about his comments from last night. He should have expected this. "I see," he said carefully. "I heard what you said at the reception yesterday," Sofia continued. Her tone wasn't angry, which surprised him. Just matter of fact, about mariachi being common music. Street entertainment, not requiring real mastery. Alessandro felt a flicker of annoyance. He'd stated his professional opinion. He wasn't going to apologize for having standards. "I simply made an observation based on my experience and training." "Your experience with mariachi music?" Sofia asked. "How many mariachi performances have you actually watched?" Complete performances, not just background music at a restaurant. The question caught him off guard. I don't need to eat an entire bad meal to know the kitchen isn't capable of fine dining, he replied, a bit more sharply than he intended. Sophia didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed to have expected that response. So none. You've never actually watched a serious mariachi performance. I've heard enough to form an opinion. That's fair, Sophia said, and her reasonableness threw him off balance again. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. But I'd like to make you a proposition. Alessandro raised an eyebrow. What kind of proposition? Come watch my performance this afternoon. Just 30 minutes of your time. Watch with an open mind, with the same attention you'd give to any musical performance you're judging. Really listen. She paused, maintaining that steady eye contact. If afterward you still believe mariachi is common music that doesn't require mastery, then I'll accept your judgment. I won't argue. I won't say another word about it. And if I don't have time, Alessandro asked, though he was intrigued despite himself. The showcase starts at 3 o'clock. You have a 2-hour break in your judging schedule from 2:30 to 4:30. She'd done her homework. I'll be performing at 3:15. 30 minutes, and then you can return to judging the classical performances. Alessandro studied her. There was something compelling about her quiet confidence. She wasn't begging or arguing. She was simply offering him a challenge. And if he was honest with himself, turning down the challenge would make him look like he was afraid to back up his own opinions. You understand that I'll be evaluating your performance by the same standards I apply to classical violin, he said. I won't lower my expectations just because it's a different genre. I wouldn't want you to, Sophia replied immediately. That's the whole point. Judge it by the standards of serious musicianship, technical skill, emotional expression, mastery of the instrument. That's all I'm asking. Alessandro considered for a moment. His pride wouldn't let him walk away from this. Besides, it would be an easy 30 minutes. He'd watch, confirm his initial assessment, and that would be the end of it. Fine, I'll be there at 3:15. Thank you, Sophia said simply. She didn't smile triumphantly or make a show of her victory. She just nodded once and turned to leave. Miss Mendez, Alessandro called after her. She stopped and looked back. Don't expect me to change my mind just because you're passionate about your music. Passion doesn't equal mastery. I know, Sophia said. That's why I'm not relying on passion alone. Then she walked away, leaving Alessandro alone with his thoughts. The morning passed in a blur of performances. Alessandro judged each one carefully, making detailed notes, scoring technical proficiency and artistic interpretation. Most were adequate. A few showed promise. None were exceptional. It was what he'd expected. During lunch, he found himself thinking about Sophia. There was something about her approach that bothered him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. She hadn't argued with him, hadn't gotten emotional or defensive. She'd simply offered him a chance to see for himself. It was almost annoying how reasonable she'd been. At 2:30, Alessandro announced he was taking his break. The other judges nodded, barely looking up from their own notes. He made his way through the building, following signs to the smaller concert hall where the showcase would take place. When he arrived, the room was already filling with people. Families, young people, older couples, even some children. The atmosphere was different from the formal classical performances he was used to. People were chatting, laughing, greeting each other. It felt more like a community gathering than a concert. Alessandro found a seat in the front row as Sophia had suggested. He sat down, crossed his arms, and prepared himself for what he assumed would be a tolerable but ultimately simple performance. Around him, people continued to file in, the excited buzz of conversation filling the space. A few people glanced at him curiously. He wondered if they recognized him from last night. If they knew he was the judge who dismissed their music as common. Let them look. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to prove a point. At exactly 3:15, the lights dimmed slightly. The crowd quieted. From the side of the stage, musicians began to emerge. Alessandro counted them. 8 in total. Trumpets, guitars of different sizes. A large bass-like instrument he didn't know the name of, and there in the center, Sophia. She'd changed clothes. Now she wore the traditional mariachi outfit, a fitted jacket and pants decorated with intricate embroidery and silver buttons. Her hair was styled differently too, partially up with a decorative piece. She looked professional, almost regal. The ensemble took their positions. Sophia stood front and center, her violin held loosely at her side. She looked out at the audience, and for just a moment her eyes found Alessandro. There was no challenge in her gaze now. No smugness, just focus. The look of someone about to do something they'd prepared their entire life for. Alessandro shifted in his seat, uncrossed his arms, then crossed them again. He told himself he was ready to be unimpressed, ready to sit through this and then politely maintain his original position. But deep down, in a place he wasn't quite ready to acknowledge, Alessandro Rossi felt the smallest flicker of doubt. What if he was wrong? What if this young woman was about to show him something he'd been too proud to see? The thought was uncomfortable, so uncomfortable that he pushed it away immediately. No, he wasn't wrong. 30 years of experience didn't lie. Classical training didn't lie. He knew music. He knew mastery. And he was about to prove it. Sophia raised her violin to her shoulder. The other musicians readied their instruments. And in the moment before the music began, the entire room held its breath. The first notes hit Alessandro like a wave. Sophia's bow struck the strings with such force and precision that his entire body tensed. This wasn't the gentle folk melody he'd expected. This was something else entirely. The violin sang out bright and fierce, cutting through the air with crystalline clarity. The trumpets joined in, their sound bold and brassy, but it was Sophia's violin that led the charge. Her fingers moved across the fingerboard in a blur, executing runs that would challenge any violinist. Fast, intricate passages that required not just speed but absolute accuracy. One wrong note, one mistaken fingering, and the whole thing would fall apart. But there were no wrong notes. Alessandro uncrossed his arms without realizing it. He leaned forward slightly, his trained ear picking apart what he was hearing. The rhythm was complex, syncopated in ways that classical music rarely attempted. The violin had to navigate these rhythmic patterns while maintaining melodic clarity, all at a breakneck pace. The piece was called La Negra, though Alessandro didn't know that. He didn't know the history behind it, didn't understand the cultural significance. All he knew was what his ears were telling him, and they were telling him something he hadn't expected. This required skill. Real skill. Sophia's bow arm moved with controlled power, not the delicate, subtle movements of classical violin, but bold, decisive strokes that produced a bright, cutting tone. Yet even in that brightness there was nuance. She could shade a phrase, soften a note, create dynamics that drew the listener in and then pushed them back with the next crescendo. The other instruments wove around her violin. The guitars, he realized, weren't just strumming simple chords. They were playing intricate rhythmic patterns, supporting and challenging the melody at the same time. The large bass instrument, which someone behind him whispered was called a guitarin, provided a foundation that was anything but simple. The player's fingers moved constantly, creating a walking bass line that would make a jazz musician nod in appreciation. And the trumpets. God, the trumpets. They weren't just playing harmony. They were engaging in a kind of musical conversation with Sophia's violin, trading phrases, building tension, creating moments of pure joy and others of surprising melancholy. Alessandro's critical mind was working overtime. He found himself analyzing Sophia's technique the way he would any serious violinist. Her vibrato was controlled but expressive. Her intonation was spot on, even in the highest registers. The double stops playing two strings simultaneously were clean and perfectly in tune. That alone was difficult enough in slower classical pieces. At this speed it was nearly impossible. Yet she made it look effortless. The piece shifted and suddenly the tempo increased. Alessandro actually caught his breath. The entire ensemble accelerated together, perfectly synchronized, as Sophia's violin climbed higher and higher into registers that most violinists avoided, unless absolutely necessary. The notes came so fast they almost blurred together, yet each one was distinct, clear, purposeful. How long had she trained to do this? How many hours of practice did it take to build the muscle memory, the finger strength, the stamina required to play at this intensity? The audience around him was clapping along now, caught up in the infectious rhythm. Children bounced in their seats. An elderly man in the row behind Alessandro was smiling so wide his eyes had nearly disappeared. This music meant something to them. It wasn't just entertainment. It was connection, identity, home. But Alessandro couldn't think about that right now. His entire focus was on what he was hearing. and what he was hearing was forcing him to confront an uncomfortable truth. The piece built to what he thought would be a climax, but instead it transitioned seamlessly into another melody. Sophia's violin took on a different character now. Where before it had been bright and joyful, now it sang with a kind of longing. The melody was beautiful, genuinely beautiful, with the kind of emotional depth that transcended genre or style. This was the part that affected Alessandro most, though he would have struggled to explain why. Maybe it was because emotion was something he understood, something he'd spent his entire career trying to convey through his own playing. And what Sophia was expressing now through this common music he'd dismissed was as profound as anything he'd heard in the concert halls of Europe. She wasn't just playing notes. She was telling a story. Her violin sang of love and loss, of celebration and sorrow, of a people and a culture that had survived and thrived through centuries of change. Every phrase had meaning. Every note had purpose. Alessandro realized with a jolt of recognition that this was what he'd been missing in his own performances lately. This authenticity, this connection between the music and the musician's soul. He'd become so focused on technical perfection, on executing each piece exactly as written, that he'd lost something essential along the way. The music shifted again. This time the entire ensemble joined together in what sounded like a celebration. The rhythm was infectious, impossible to resist. Sophia's violin danced above it all, sometimes leading, sometimes responding, always perfectly integrated with the whole, and the stamina required. Alessandro was realizing that now too. Sophia had been playing continuously for nearly 20 minutes, much of it at extreme speed and in the highest registers of the instrument. There were no breaks, no moments to rest her embouchure or shake out her bow arm. Classical violin concertos had orchestral interludes where the soloist could breathe. This had none. Her bow arm showed no signs of fatigue. Her fingers remained precise. Her tone stayed consistent, strong, focused. A new melody emerged, one that made several people in the audience gasp with recognition. Sophia's violin soared, executing runs that cascaded down the fingerboard like waterfalls. The technical demands were staggering. Rapid string crossings, harmonics that rang out like bells. Pizzicato sections where she had to pluck the strings with her right hand, while simultaneously bowing with her left. Wait, not left. She was doing it the other way around, bowing with her right while plucking with her left, creating two independent melodic lines simultaneously. Alessandro had seen this technique in classical music, but never executed with such casual mastery, and certainly never at this speed. He wasn't just impressed anymore. He was humbled. The piece, which he now understood, was actually a medley of several traditional songs, built toward its true climax. The entire ensemble accelerated one final time. Sophia's violin climbed to its highest note, held it with a vibrato that made the sound shimmer and pulse, and then descended in a flourish of notes that ended with a decisive, powerful stroke. The final chord rang out, and for one perfect moment there was silence. Then the audience exploded. People leapt to their feet, clapping, cheering, whistling. The elderly man behind Alessandro was wiping his eyes. A young woman a few seats down was on her feet, hands pressed to her chest, overcome with emotion. Children were jumping and laughing. Alessandro remained seated, not because he wasn't moved, but because he couldn't quite process what he'd just experienced. His hands came together automatically, clapping, but his mind was elsewhere, racing, recalculating, reconsidering everything he thought he knew. Sophia and her ensemble bowed. She caught Alessandro's eye for just a second, and in that glance there was no triumph, no smugness or satisfaction at proving him wrong. Just a quiet question. Do you understand now? Alessandro didn't trust himself to respond. He just kept clapping as the ensemble took another bow and began to exit the stage. Around him, the audience continued their standing ovation, calling out names, expressing appreciation in rapid Spanish that Alessandro couldn't follow. When the applause finally died down and people began to file out, still chatting excitedly, Alessandro remained in his seat. His mind was reeling. His carefully constructed hierarchy of musical value, built over 30 years of training and performance, had just been shaken to its foundation. He'd been wrong. Completely, embarrassingly wrong. And now he had to figure out what to do about it. Alessandro sat alone in the empty concert hall for nearly 10 minutes after everyone else had left. The silence felt heavy, almost accusatory. His hands rested on his knees and he stared at the empty stage where Sofia had just performed. He'd been so certain, so absolutely convinced that his 30 years of experience had taught him everything he needed to know about music, about mastery, about what deserved respect and what didn't. And in 30 minutes, a 25-year-old woman had demolished that certainty completely. The worst part wasn't that he'd been wrong. The worst part was how casually he'd dismissed something he'd never bothered to understand. How quickly he'd judged an entire tradition based on nothing but prejudice and ignorance. Finally, Alessandro stood. His legs felt unsteady as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He made his way backstage where performers were still packing up their instruments and chatting with family members who'd come to watch. He felt out of place here, like an intruder in a world he'd insulted without invitation. He found Sofia near the back, carefully placing her violin in its case. She'd changed out of her performance outfit and was back in jeans and a simple shirt. When she noticed him approaching, she didn't look smug or victorious. She just waited, letting him speak first. Alessandro started, then stopped. The words he'd prepared in his head suddenly felt inadequate. I owe you an apology. Sofia closed her violin case and turned to face him properly. Okay, she said quietly. Not just to you. To everyone I offended last night. Alessandro ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that made him look older and more vulnerable than his usual composed self. What I said was ignorant and arrogant. I dismissed something I'd never taken the time to understand. Yes, you did, Sofia agreed. She wasn't letting him off easy, but there was no cruelty in her voice, just honesty. That performance, Alessandro continued, the technical demands alone, the speed, the precision, the stamina required. I've performed Paganini's most difficult caprices, and what you just did was every bit as demanding. Thank you for recognizing that, Sofia said. But it's more than just technique, isn't it? Alessandro found himself genuinely curious now. The way he used to be as a young student discovering music for the first time. The way you played, the emotion behind it. That came from somewhere deeper than just technical training. Sofia nodded slowly. Can I ask you something? How long have you been playing violin? I started when I was 5. So 47 years. I started when I was 10, Sofia said. 15 years of training. But I wasn't learning from books written centuries ago by European composers. I was learning from my grandfather, who learned from his father, who learned from his father. The techniques I use today, some of them have been passed down through generations of mariachi musicians. Alessandro listened carefully. This was important, he realized. This was the part he'd completely missed. The rapid string crossings you saw, that's not something I learned from a conservatory textbook. That's a technique developed specifically for mariachi violin, refined over more than 100 years. The way I hold my bow, the way I produce that bright tone, the ornamentation style, all of it comes from a living tradition. You mentioned training, Alessandro said. What kind of training? Sofia's expression suggested she'd been waiting for him to ask. I practiced 6 hours a day for 10 years. I studied under 3 different master mariachi violinists. I learned hundreds of songs, their histories, the proper way to play each one. I studied the regional variations, the different styles from different parts of Mexico. Alessandro felt another wave of shame wash over him. 6 hours a day for 10 years. That was conservatory-level dedication. But you also have classical training, he said, remembering what she'd mentioned earlier. Why choose mariachi? Why not both? Sofia asked. I did complete classical training. 4 years at a conservatory. I can play Bach and Vivaldi. I've performed Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto. But mariachi is my heritage. It's my culture. It speaks to my soul in a way that classical music, as beautiful as it is, never quite did. And you don't see that as limiting? Alessandro asked, then immediately regretted the question. Old habits died hard, but Sofia didn't seem offended. Do you see your dedication to classical music as limiting? Or is it a choice to master something you love? The question hit home. Alessandro had never thought of his own specialization as limiting. It was simply what he did, what he'd devoted his life to. Why should Sofia's choice be any different? I also need to tell you something else, Sofia continued. I'm not the best mariachi violinist in Mexico. Not even close. There are musicians who've been playing for 50, 60 years. People who know 5 times as many songs as I do. My teacher, for example, has been performing for 45 years. He can play for 6 hours straight without a break, and he's 70 years old. Alessandro's eyes widened. 6 hours? Mariachi performances at celebrations often last all night. You need stamina, repertoire, and the ability to read the room, to know what song fits what moment. It's not just about technical skill. It's about connection, tradition, community. They were interrupted by an older man approaching, someone who'd apparently been watching their conversation from a distance. He wore glasses and had gray hair, and he carried himself with quiet dignity. "Sophia," he said warmly. "Beautiful performance, as always." "Thank you, Maestro," Sophia replied, and the respect in her voice was obvious. She turned to Alessandro. "This is Maestro Rivera. He's the teacher I mentioned. He's forgotten more about mariachi violin than I'll ever know." Maestro Rivera extended his hand to Alessandro, who shook it, feeling suddenly like a student again rather than an accomplished performer. "I heard about your comments yesterday," the older man said, his English tinged with a thick accent. "But Sophia said you came to watch today. That takes courage." "It takes humility," Alessandro corrected, "which I should have had from the beginning." Maestro Rivera smiled slightly. "The most accomplished musicians are often the ones who know the least about music outside their own tradition. It's not unusual, but it's good that you're willing to learn." "I want to understand," Alessandro said, and he meant it. "What I saw today, what I heard, it was remarkable. But I realize I only understood a fraction of it." "That's because mariachi is more than just notes on a page," Maestro Rivera explained. "Every song has a story. Every melody has meaning. When Sophia played La Negra, she wasn't just executing technical passages. She was celebrating Mexican identity, playing a song that represents joy and pride for millions of people." Alessandro thought about his own performances. When was the last time he'd felt that kind of connection to what he was playing? When had he last performed something that meant so much to so many people? "The Son Jarocho section," Maestro Rivera continued. "That comes from Veracruz. The zapateado rhythm, the specific bowing technique, all of it is rooted in a specific place and time. You can't learn that from a book. You have to live it, breathe it, understand the culture it comes from," Sophia added. "And it's not frozen in time either. Mariachi evolves. New songs are written, new techniques developed, but it stays connected to its roots. That's what makes it powerful." Alessandro listened to them both, absorbing information, asking questions, genuinely trying to understand. They spoke about the different instruments in the ensemble, the role each one played. They explained the call and response patterns, the improvisation that happened within traditional structures, the regional variations across Mexico. An hour passed without Alessandro noticing. His mind was working in a way it hadn't in years, making connections, discovering new perspectives, questioning assumptions he'd held for decades. "Could I?" Alessandro hesitated. "Would it be possible for me to learn more? I'm here for 3 more days. I don't want to impose, but..." Sophia and Maestro Rivera exchanged a glance. Something passed between them, an understanding. "Tomorrow evening," Maestro Rivera said, "we have a rehearsal. Some of the best mariachi musicians in Mexico City. If you'd like to come, observe, ask questions, you're welcome. And be prepared to be humbled again," Sophia added with a small smile, "because what you saw today was just one style, one approach. There's so much more." Alessandro felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Excitement. The same excitement he'd felt as a young student discovering music for the first time. He'd thought he knew everything. He'd been comfortable in his expertise, but now he realized that comfort had been stagnation. And this feeling, this nervous excitement about learning something completely new, was exactly what he'd been missing. "I'll be there," he said. "And thank you, both of you, for your patience with a stubborn old musician who needed to be proven wrong." "You're not old," Sophia said. "And everyone has something to learn. Even masters. Especially masters," Alessandro thought. "Especially them." The rehearsal space was nothing like Alessandro expected. No grand concert hall with perfect acoustics. Instead, it was a modest community center with folding chairs, fluorescent lights, and a slightly scuffed wooden floor. But the moment he walked in, he felt the energy. 8 musicians were setting up, tuning instruments, greeting each other with the easy familiarity of people who'd played together for years. Sophia met him at the door. "You came," she said, and he could hear genuine warmth in her voice. "I said I would," Alessandro replied. He was carrying a notebook, something he hadn't brought to a musical event in years. Tonight he wasn't the expert. He was the student. Maestro Rivera waved him over to a chair positioned slightly off to the side. close enough to observe but not in the way. "Welcome," the older man said. "Tonight we're preparing for a wedding performance this weekend. You'll hear us work through arrangements, make adjustments, discuss interpretation." Alessandro settled into his chair as the musicians began. What struck him immediately was the level of discussion happening. These weren't people mindlessly running through songs. They were analyzing, debating, refining. "The transition into the second verse feels rushed," one of the trumpet players said. "A man probably in his 50s with calloused fingers and kind eyes. Can we take it down just a touch, let the emotion build?" "But if we slow down there, we'll lose the energy from the first section," countered the guitar player. A younger man with impressive arm muscles that Alessandro now understood came from wrestling that massive instrument for hours on end. They worked through it, trying different approaches, listening to each other, making adjustments. It reminded Alessandro of chamber music rehearsals, the collaborative process of finding the right interpretation. Except here there was no written score. Everything was in their heads, in their fingers, passed down and internalized through years of practice. Sophia's violin sang out a melody, and the other musicians locked in around her. Alessandro watched their faces. They weren't just playing notes. They were communicating, responding to subtle shifts in dynamics and tempo, creating something together that was more than the sum of its parts. After about 40 minutes, Maestro Rivera called for a break. The musicians set down their instruments, some stretching, others grabbing water. Alessandro noticed how natural it all felt, like a family gathering rather than a formal rehearsal. "What do you think so far?" Sophia asked, sitting down next to him. "It's remarkable," Alessandro said honestly. "The level of musicianship, but also the collaboration. Everyone has a voice." "That's essential in mariachi," Sophia explained. "Yes, the violin often leads, but we're an ensemble. The guitarron player needs to feel the rhythm. The trumpets need to know when to soar and when to support. We listen to each other constantly." Maestro Rivera joined them, easing into a chair with a slight groan. "Old knees," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "They don't appreciate all the standing anymore." "How long have you been performing?" Alessandro asked. "I played my first professional job when I was 16. That was 52 years ago." Maestro Rivera's eyes grew distant with memory. "My father was a mariachi and his father before him. I grew up surrounded by this music. It was like learning to speak, you know? You don't remember the exact moment you understood language. You just absorbed it. Did you ever study formally?" Alessandro asked. "Not in a conservatory, if that's what you mean. But I studied with masters. I learned by playing thousands of performances, making mistakes, getting better. I learned by listening, really listening, to the old recordings, to the legends who came before me." One of the other musicians, an older woman who played the vihuela, came over. "Is this the judge from the competition?" she asked Sophia in English, glancing at Alessandro with open curiosity. "This is Alessandro Rossi," Sophia confirmed. The woman studied him for a moment, and Alessandro felt himself being evaluated. "I heard what you said about our music," she said plainly. "That it was common." Alessandro felt his face flush. "I did say that, and I was completely wrong." "I'm sorry," the woman nodded slowly. "At least you came to learn. That's more than most would do." She extended her hand. "I'm Catalina. I've been playing mariachi for 38 years. Alessandro shook her hand, feeling the calluses on her fingers, the strength in her grip. 38 years. That's incredible. "You want to know something funny?" Catalina said, settling into a nearby chair. "I also studied classical guitar when I was young. Spent 5 years at it, but mariachi called to me. This music, it's in my blood. It tells our stories, our joys, our sorrows. When I play at a wedding, I'm not just providing entertainment. I'm part of their celebration, their memory. That song will stay with them for the rest of their lives." Alessandro thought about his own recent performances. Symphony halls full of polite audiences who clapped at appropriate moments. Beautiful music, certainly. But how much of it truly touched people the way Catalina was describing? "Can I ask you something?" Alessandro ventured. "In classical music, we have the composer's intentions to honor, the written score to follow. How do you balance tradition with individual expression in mariachi?" Maestro Rivera's face lit up. "That's an excellent question. The songs themselves are traditional, yes, but each performance is unique. I might play Cielito Lindo 1,000 times, but each time it's different. The tempo might shift based on the energy of the moment. The ornamentation I add will change based on how I'm feeling. what the audience needs. It's like jazz in that way, Sophia added. There's a structure, but within that structure we have freedom. We can improvise, add our own voice, respond to what's happening in the moment. But that requires incredible skill, Alessandro said, understanding dawning. You need to know the tradition so thoroughly that you can improvise within it without losing its essence. Exactly, Maestro Rivera said. That's what takes decades to master. Anyone can learn the notes, but to truly understand mariachi, to feel it in your bones, that takes a lifetime. The rehearsal resumed, and Alessandro watched with new eyes. He saw the trumpet player making split-second decisions about dynamics. He noticed the guitar-on player adjusting his rhythm based on subtle cues from Sophia's violin. He observed the way they all breathed together, moved together, created music together. Then Maestro Rivera did something unexpected. He looked at Alessandro and said, "Would you like to try?" Alessandro's eyes widened. "Try what?" "Playing with us. Just a simple song. Las Mañanitas. It's a birthday song, very traditional. The melody is straightforward." "I don't have my violin," Alessandro said, though part of him was curious. "Use mine," Sophia offered immediately, already moving to get her instrument. Alessandro felt panic rising. "I've never played mariachi. I don't know the style, the technique." "That's okay," Maestro Rivera said gently. "We all started somewhere. Just try to follow along, listen, and let the music guide you." Sophia handed him her violin and bow. Alessandro held them carefully, reverently. This was her instrument, her connection to her tradition. Taking it felt like a huge responsibility. The other musicians positioned themselves, ready to play. Maestro Rivera hummed the melody first, letting Alessandro hear it. It was simple as promised, but even in its simplicity, Alessandro could hear the character that made it distinctly mariachi. "Ready?" Maestro Rivera asked. Alessandro raised the violin to his shoulder. His hands, which had performed in front of thousands, were actually shaking slightly. "Ready?" he said, though he wasn't sure he was. The music began. The guitars set up the rhythm, the trumpets came in with harmony, and Alessandro tried to find the melody. His first few notes were tentative, cautious. They didn't sound right. Too classical, too refined, not bright enough, more bow, Maestro Rivera called out encouragingly. "Press harder. Let it sing." Alessandro adjusted, pushing his bow into the string with more force than he would ever use in classical music. The sound changed, became brighter, more present. "Yes," Sophia called out. "Like that!" He was sweating now, concentrating harder than he had in years. The rhythm kept tripping him up. His classical training wanted him to play one way, but mariachi demanded something different. His fingers knew scales and arpeggios, but these ornamentations, these quick decorative notes, they were foreign. He made mistakes. Several of them. Notes that came out wrong, rhythm that faltered, passages where he simply got lost. But the other musicians didn't stop. They supported him, gave him space when he needed it, filled in when he stumbled. And slowly, gradually, something clicked. He started to feel the rhythm in his body rather than just counting it in his head. His bow started to move with more confidence, producing that bright mariachi tone. He wasn't playing it perfectly. He wasn't even playing it well by any objective standard. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Alessandro wasn't thinking about perfection. He was just playing, feeling, connecting. The song ended and the other musicians broke into applause. Alessandro lowered the violin, breathing hard, and realized he was grinning like a fool. "How did it feel?" Sophia asked, taking her violin back. "Terrifying," Alessandro admitted, "and wonderful. And humbling. I've played violin for 47 years, and I felt like a complete beginner just now." "That's because you were," Maestro Rivera said kindly. "In mariachi, you were a beginner. But that's beautiful, isn't it? After all these years, you can still discover something new. You can still be challenged. You can still learn." Alessandro nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The old maestro was right. He'd been so comfortable in his expertise, so secure in his mastery that he'd stopped growing. He'd stopped being challenged. He'd stopped experiencing the pure joy of struggling with something new. The evening continued, but Alessandro would remember that moment for the rest of his life. The moment he held Sophia's violin and tried something completely outside his comfort zone. The moment he failed, and it felt liberating rather than shameful. When the rehearsal finally ended, Alessandro thanked each musician personally. He exchanged contact information with Sofia and Maestro Rivera, promising to stay in touch. As he walked back to his hotel through the Mexico City night, he felt different. Lighter somehow, despite carrying the weight of his own prejudice and ignorance. He'd come to Mexico thinking he would judge others. Instead, he'd been forced to judge himself. And in that judgment, he'd found himself wanting. But he'd also found something else, a reminder of why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Not for the prestige or the perfect technique, but for the connection, the feeling. The way music could bridge cultures, challenge assumptions, and bring people together. Alessandro knew he'd never be a mariachi violinist. That wasn't the point. The point was that he'd opened his mind to something new, acknowledged his ignorance, and learned to respect a tradition he'd dismissed. When he returned to Italy, he would tell this story. He'd tell his students about the young woman who taught him humility, about the master who showed him there was always more to learn, about the moment he realized that expertise could sometimes be the enemy of understanding. And he would never again dismiss music he didn't understand, because now he knew the difference between common music and music of the common people. One was an insult. The other was a celebration of culture, tradition, and the human spirit that refuses to be silenced. That difference, he'd learned, changed everything.